Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's class. Let's get straight to it. So in this week's Torah portion, finally, after 210 years of being enslaved and abused by the Egyptians, the Jewish people are finally free from Egypt after a series of miracles and plagues, culminating with the splitting of the sea, and other Jewish people are finally free. It's only been 30 days since they left, roughly 30 days since they left Egypt. And we know, miraculously, all they had with them was some dough that had no time to rise, and they find themselves running out of the last crumbs of matzah. So, like the good generation of Jews of the desert, they come complaining to Moshe Rabbeinu and they say, "We're hungry, give us food. Feed us. What are we going to do? We're going to die out here in the desert." And that's when Moshe Rabbeinu turns to God and the manna starts to fall from heaven. Just a few fascinating ideas. We know that the manna fell every morning. The manna fell, they would collect it, and like Moses told them, only take a particular amount for your household because it only lasts one day. Every single day you'll have to go and collect. And we know some people had difficulty with that because in essence, this was a test of their faith. Would they keep the faith that tomorrow the manna would fall again and that God would provide? Or, like human nature, if we don't have it, we get very nervous. What's going to be tomorrow? What's going to happen? Is the entire world going to fall apart? And not everybody was able to be so faithful, but the manna would self-destruct. It would turn into worms. Now, in addition to that, another reason why the manna fell every day was to teach the Jewish people about gratitude, so that every day they would recognize where their food is coming from, and like this, they would be able to give the proper thanks to whom it was coming from. And these two ideas were really to prepare them for, so to say, the real world that they would be coming to, when they'd be coming to the land of Israel, when they would have to work the land, when they'd have to earn a living, they'd have to work the field. Times would be tough, but they would have to keep that faith and that gratitude. And this was to ingrain these ideas into the Jewish nation, the very fabric of the Jewish nation, over 40 years. Now, the manna, the Midrash tells us that whatever the person wanted it to taste like, that's what it tasted like. If you like chicken, it tasted like chicken. If you liked lasagna, it tasted like lasagna. And if you liked steak, it was nice and juicy like a steak. Now, the question is, what was the manna's default taste? In other words, what if a person didn't have a particular taste in mind? What would happen then? This is a beautiful idea saying brought in the name of the Chafetz Chaim, where he says that the default taste of the manna somebody wrote in the chat, Chinese food. Or maybe it was like matzah. But he says the default taste of the manna was tasteless. It was bland. It had no taste. And he says the idea is if a person has no aspirations of their own, the manna would remain tasteless and bland. And he says that this was a representation of life. A person can live life day in, day out, not capitalizing, not giving their taste and their flavor to each and every day. Because for some people, they live such a life where days come and days go. And it makes absolutely no difference because they're not actually living their life. They're not actually, as we say, by Avram Avinu, Baba Yamin, where he came into his days, where he showed up at each and every day with his flavor, with what he had to give each day. That's what he did. And that's one of the concepts that the manna was really teaching the Jewish people in the desert. Somebody asked if they took extra, would the extra manna also spoil? And the answer is yes. And that's exactly the point. And like the Torah says clearly, those who took more did not have more, and those who took less also did not have less. Everybody miraculously had exactly what they needed. Now, in addition to all of these ideas, Hashem tells Moshe to tell the Jewish people, tell them that on Friday, they will receive a double portion of manna, and tell them to collect the double portion, because on Shabbos morning, the manna will not fall. And this actually is the source for the custom that we had, that both Friday night and Shabbos day, by the meals, by the Shabbat meals, we have what is known as Lechem Mishnah, the two breads, and that is to represent and to remember the miracle of the manna, and that God gave a double portion on Friday, so that on Shabbos we would not have to collect it. Now, what happens is, on the first Shabbos, there were some nudniks, some hoodlums, some rebel rousers, because their name comes up over and over again, who decided, you know what, let's go see if the manna actually fell or not. Now, really what they were doing was they contrived a plan that they wanted to prove that Moshe Rabbeinu was making some stuff up. They wanted to prove that God was even misleading them, and that really the manna would fall Shabbos morning. What they were trying to do was to break the people's belief and spirit. So what they did was, Shabbos morning, they woke up very early, and they took their own manna, because of course everybody had manna that morning. They put it out in the field a lot earlier than anybody was used to going out to the field, and before everybody else in the camps were up. Then they came back to the camps and they said, let's see if the manna really doesn't fall on Shabbos morning. And their plan was to bring a whole crowd of people and say, look, Moses lied to us, or God lied to us, somebody's lying to us over here. And they come out to the field. Lo and behold, there's nothing. Obviously, they didn't get the point that this manna was miraculous. God was running the show. Moses wasn't lying. They couldn't beat that system. And this enrages God, so to say. And God says, is it not enough that I'm supplying everything for you? Why won't you people believe what is going on over here? Why would you people even believe to follow these two fools, Dasan and Aviram, out into the field? Enough's enough. And let it be known. And the words read as follows. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Let each man remain in his place. No man should leave his place on the seventh day. And like that, you stay home, stay in your house. There's no need. There's a literal context of what's going on over here. There's no need to leave your tent to go find your food in the fields on Shabbos morning, because on Friday you should have taken a double portion because God has provided. Now, based on this last verse, Maimonides says there's a fascinating idea when it comes to Shabbos. And that is, we all know that on Shabbat, there are 39 root works that are not allowed to be done. So, for example, we are not allowed to cook. We are not allowed to sew. We are not allowed to build. We are not allowed to destroy for the sake of building. We are not allowed to write or erase, and many different laws of creation. At the same time, there's a very fascinating law, and that is, if anybody wants to chime in on this question, feel free to unmute yourself. How much can a person walk on Shabbos?
2,000 amas.
So Dr. Shamoy just said 2,000 amas. So now what is he referring?
If you put an Erev Chumen, you can go 4,000 amas.
So let's get into this idea for a moment. Let's explore this now. And this is what Maimonides says is happening in this verse. That the Torah is actually telling us that there is a prohibition when it comes to how far a person can walk on Shabbos. And that is that a person is not allowed to leave, right? Because the verse says the person should not leave his place. So Maimonides says, biblically speaking, what is his place referring to? That refers to going beyond the camp. But to what distance? The distance of the camp. How big was the Jewish encampment? It was roughly 11.5 kilometers, known as 12 mil. So based on this, Maimonides understands that there's a biblical prohibition to walk 11.5 kilometers beyond your city limits, or really the last house in the city. So if you wanted to go on a really long walk on Shabbos afternoon, you can walk around your city, and in your own city, you can walk around as much as you want, which means if you lived in Manhattan, you can walk north, south, east, west all day long without stopping. As long as you haven't gone beyond the last house, you haven't gone 11.5 kilometers, there's no restriction. The restriction is only 11.5 kilometers beyond the last house of the city. However, the rabbis came along And because there are a lot of technical details of how to calculate this 11.5 kilometers, there's a lot of technical details of which is the last house, what point, are there houses further on the border along or closer on the border? What are we going to look at? And therefore they said to keep it simple, as Dr. Shamot pointed out, it's going to be 2,000 amis, which means that rabbinically, you only have just short of a kilometer. It's about 960 meters. That's as far as you can go from the last house of the city. Now, they give it a little bit more leeway than that, being that the last house of the city is a very loose term because is it the last house on this border? Is it the last house a little further down? And therefore, they said make somewhat of a figurative square around the city. And this square should go beyond the last houses at any point of the border. And from that, you have just under a kilometer that you can walk. Beyond that, one may not go. But within the city, you can walk the city several times, as however many times you want. No restrictions on that. Now, it seems like a pretty interesting law. Now, let's just explore a few more details of the law before we really discuss what's behind it. And that is, what if you're camping? What if you find yourself in the desert? You're on a road trip and you're not inside a city for Shabbos. So what kind of limits do you have then? And Maimonides states clearly, based on the Talmud, that from wherever you are, you can go 2,000 amis, or again, roughly a kilometer, in any direction. So you become, wherever you're setting up your tent, setting up your motorhome, setting up shop for Shabbos, that becomes your place. And like Dr. Shemot pointed out, another detail in this law is that what happens if you do need to go beyond that limit? Now, a classic case of this would be, right, if you needed to walk somewhere on Shabbos, but you knew before Shabbos was coming in that you might have to walk over to the next town, or for example, as it was in the olden days where you had, let's say, the mohel, the one who would do this, perform the circumcision, lived in one town, and 2 towns over, they needed a mohel Shabbos morning, and between the 2 towns, there was more than a kilometer. So what's he supposed to do then? So what he could do is, for every kilometer, he can set up a little station that has some kind of food. It can be a matzah and a banana. It can be a matzah and a hard-boiled egg. And like that establishes that there's a connection between point A and point B, and that gives you another kilometer from your post. And you can make several posts. If you know before Shabbos that you're going to need to go out to that distance, you can set it up. Otherwise, you got to stay within a kilometer of the city limits. Okay. Now, not to make things more complicated, but according to most other opinions, most other rabbinic opinions, and actually Jewish law follows these other opinions, you see, Maimonides says that this is a biblical command, and that the biblical command originally gave you about 11.5 kilometers. The other commentaries understand that there's absolutely no biblical commandment involved. This whole idea of the borders of Shabbos, the borders of how far you can go beyond the city limits, are 100% rabbinic. And the rabbis at one point during our history realized that for whatever reason they needed to enact this law. And originally it was only enacted based on 1 kilometer, whatever, 960 meters. And there was never a time where it was 11.5 kilometers. They disagree with Maimonides on that. But ultimately, most of the differences between these two opinions is going to be mainly in the field of academia, as opposed to practical Jewish law, because everybody agrees nowadays that according to Jewish law, it's 960 meters beyond the city limits. Now, the theory of why it's 960 meters beyond the city limits is because we know that in Torah, when it comes to splitting up the land of Israel, every portion of land, every city that was designed and dedicated from God, given through Joshua to all the tribes, each city had to have a minimum of 960 meters around it for grazing. And because of that, the rabbis understood that up to 960 meters around the city is still part of the city itself. And basically, the law is you are not allowed to leave your city, your ultimate city limits, on Shabbos. Okay. Now, I hope that's clear. If there are any questions, feel free to chime in at this point, just in case some of it may have been a little bit too technical. All right. Now, the question is, what's the deal with these limits? What's the deal with limitations? Who cares where I walk, how much I walk on Shabbos? In other words, we're not restricting the amount of walking you can do. You can walk 100 kilometers on Shabbos if you'd like. However, we're saying that as long as it's within the city limits. And the question is, what exactly is going on? Why do the rabbis care? It's not like they were telling us that you can't walk that many kilometers. Because what if my house was the last house in the city? I was at the city limits, and I'm just going to take that walk. What's the difference? In order to appreciate this, we have to zoom out a little bit, and let's understand. Like I mentioned before, when it comes to the laws of Shabbos, so there's the biblical command that just as God rested from creative work on the seventh day, so too we rest from any form of creative work, which means we don't build, we don't destroy in order to build, we don't write, we don't reap, we don't plant, we don't plow, and the list goes on. Ultimately, the rabbis broke it down into 39 major acts, and then in subcategories as well. Now that's all biblical. Came along the sages. And in order to appreciate this, to just give you a little bit of background, the sages generally made two categories of enactments. And as when it comes to rabbinical enactments, there are two general categories. One is, first category is to protect society. In other words, at what areas in life would the rabbis give an enactment, make a law, pass a rabbinic ruling? That is in regards, the first area would be protecting society. An example of that would be, the rabbis instituted not to overpay for a Jewish captive. And the reason why they made that institution is because if we pay too much, the nations around us will see this as a lucrative business, and they won't stop kidnapping Jews. The moment they see that it's no different than anybody else, the moment they see that they're not going to get much out of it, or at least not going to get more than the regular slave market out of it, they won't follow it. They're not going to continue pursuing doing that. And that was one type of enactment. Within that category, another example of that is that a nursing mother who either gets divorced or, God forbid, her husband passes on, within 24 months of, if she's nursing, so within the first 24 months that the child was born, she is not allowed to remarry. And the reason being is because everybody knows that a newborn baby within 24 months needs its mother's full undivided attention, both mentally, emotionally, as well as physically. The mother's body is there for the child in order to nurse, in order to be there for this baby. Now, what would happen if we allow her to get married during that 24 months? There's, from the get-go, there's going to be somewhat of a, whether it's conscious or subconscious competition between the baby and the new husband. And that's not going to be a peaceful relationship for anybody. The rabbis were sensitive to this and said, if the mother has a newborn baby, she must wait 24 months. A third example of this would be when it comes to an inheritance claim. So the classic example of this is if you have two brothers who inherit their parents' estate, and they don't split it up. They decide that we're both going to share the estate along with their own families. Then after a few years, one of them is spending too much money on, dad's old credit card, dad's old accounts. And he says, enough's enough. We got to split the assets. At this point, we're going to go, the Jewish court is going to go and start assessing even the money that was spent. In other words, the assets that they own personally now that they spent money on. However, the exclusion for this would be anything that belongs to the children of either sibling, because it's never pleasant to drag anybody else into this fight between the two of them. Don't make it their own children's problem. And therefore, if the children have clothing, we don't count that as we don't assess that as part of the assets, and we automatically wipe that away. That was one of the ways that the rabbis being sensitive to the nature and the needs of people. Then the second category of where the rabbis make enactments, and that is to either protect the observance of Torah or to enhance the experience of Judaism. And these two really fall into the same category. Enhancing Judaism would be something along the lines of celebrating Hanukkah, celebrating Purim. These are ways where we enhance the experience of being a Jew and to be proud to be a Jew, celebrating our heritage and our history. Then there are ways that the rabbis protect the keeping of the Torah. So, for example, we're going to explore now that on Shabbos, in addition to the 39 areas where the Torah prohibits, and there's 39 actions the Torah prohibits us from doing, the rabbis added a few more. Now, with me, the areas that the rabbis added when it comes to Shabbos, we'll break it down into two general categories. One is any type of work that, even if any type of action that it itself is not a work that would fall into the 39. However, it may lead a person to transgressing one of the 39. The rabbis prohibit that. And the second is any activity that is similar. So it may not lead you to doing the real thing. It may not lead you to doing the real prohibition, but it's similar in nature. And therefore they decided to prohibit that. I'll just give you some examples of this. So, for example, the Torah forbids reaping on Shabbos, which means that if I have an apple tree and my apples are ripe and ready to come off the tree and it's Shabbos morning, according to the Torah, I am not allowed to walk over to the apple tree and pluck the apple. Okay. The rabbis came along and they said, because I'm not allowed to reap, I'm also not allowed to, for example, I wouldn't be able to collect honey from my beehive on Shabbos. Why? Because they're similar in their nature. In other words, taking honey from the beehive and taking the apple from the tree, both taking something from the source, and being that they're similar in nature, what's going to happen is if we allow the person to take honey from the beehive, after enough time, they may start saying, 1 second, if I can take honey from the beehive, so I can probably take the apple from the tree. And what's going to happen is they will end up transgressing. That's one scenario. Another scenario where the rabbis prohibited is the example of a case where the nature has nothing to do with anything. It's that it might lead me to do something wrong. So, like we said before, one is not allowed to pluck the fresh apple off the tree. However, that means seeming that I can walk up to this apple and smell it, or I can walk past the lemon tree and sniff the lemons because that beautiful aroma of the fresh fruit. The rabbis came along and says, no, you're not allowed to smell the fruit of a tree on Shabbos. And the reason being is because you might start smelling the fruit, get carried away, and next thing you know, you're plucking the lemon, you're plucking the apple, and you've just transgressed a biblical transgression. And that's how the rabbis tried to protect the observance of Shabbos, or enhance it even. Now, there is one last category when it comes to Shabbos that the rabbis made other enactments, and that is as follows. Something called the spirit of the day. Now, I'm just going to give this disclaimer. Many people use this terminology to forbid things on Shabbos, even though they are completely allowed, both rabbinically and biblically. And therefore, we have to be very careful how we use the term protecting the spirit of the day. But there is a truth to this concept, as Maimonides writes. Let me just read the text for you. Maimonides reads as follows. There are activities that are forbidden on the Shabbos, though they don't resemble the forbidden labors, nor do they lead to their performance. Why are these activities forbidden? So Maimonides says, because it is written in the book of Isaiah, if you restrain your feet because of the Shabbos and refrain from pursuing your desires on my holy day, says God, and you should honor it by refraining from following your ordinary ways, attending to your wants, and discussing mundane matters. So Maimonides says, based on this verse, accordingly, it is forbidden to tend to our concerns on Shabbos, or even to talk about them, to consult a partner on which merchandise should be sold the next day, or which should be purchased, how this building should be constructed, or which merchandise should be taken to a particular place. Such discussions are included in the prohibition against discussing mundane matters on Shabbos. And over here we have where we have to protect the spirit of the day and what the day is all about. Based on this idea, we can understand this whole idea of the rabbis putting the border around the city and restricting how far beyond the city we can travel. Simply put is, the whole purpose of Shabbos is to rest, but not just rest in the sense of, I need to relax. I need to have a day that we're just, leisurely or relaxing, leisurely distraction or the type, but rather it's supposed to be meaningful rest, which means rest that invigorates, or as they say, it's about the delight of Shabbos and Torah study. And if that's the case, yeah, I might need to take a walk on Shabbos to relax, and that's normal. That's part of Shabbos. It's part of experiencing the Shabbos day. I think in Antwerp, there's a park known as Cholent Park. It's in the Jewish sector, where everybody goes after the Cholent to have a nice little walk, spend time with the family, the kids, and that's allowed on Shabbos. However, to go and start trekking, to go beyond the city limits, to go from my normal comfortable place, even though the idea of a hike or a nice trek outside the city might sound like a leisurely experience or a nice Sunday afternoon, but that's exactly the idea. It's not Sunday afternoon, it's Shabbos. And Shabbos is not just rest in the literal sense, like we refer to it as a day off, but rather a day that we're supposed to be plugging into something, connecting to God, connecting to each other. And like that, taking a walk out of the city can lead towards distractions, unsettledness when leaving the city. And because of this, the rabbis wanted to protect the spirit of Shabbos and therefore made this enactment of not leaving the city beyond a kilometer. Okay. Now, let's understand this idea on a little bit of a deeper level. And that is, let's understand the core of what Shabbos is about. When we can understand the core of what Shabbos is about, we can start to appreciate this idea of the boundaries of Shabbos. And that is as follows. I want to read a passage to you from a work called the Sefer HaChinuch. We don't know who wrote it. We just know that they were a Levite. They lived in Barcelona, roughly in the 14th century, 13th or 14th century. And he actually wrote this book for his children, where he explains all the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah, their source, their origin, their reasons, and their application. He wrote this for them so that Shabbos afternoon they would have what to do. And he writes as follows. The root idea of this commandment is to withdraw from our engagement in honor of this day and affix within our souls the belief in the creation of the world, which is the string that draws the foundations of our faith. That we should remember for one day each week that the world was created in 6 separate days, and that on the 7th day, nothing was created. When everyone rests for one day each week, and someone asks why we rest, the answer, that we rest because God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th, reinforces the true faith among us all. Now, this idea, what does it mean that God rested? Was God tired? We get tired because we're human beings. God, who's omnipotent and omnipresent, does God really get tired? Does God really need to rest? And the truth is, the answer is no. God does not need to rest in the literal sense that we need to rest because we work hard. It drains us. We need to refresh. But many a time, the way we refresh is by doing nothing, by just turning off, by distracting ourselves, taking a nap. However, the ultimate idea of Shabbos, the ultimate idea of rest, is when we actually emulate what God was doing. You see, the entire idea of creation is something which is, so to say, external to God, outside of God. It doesn't bring out the true essence of God. Just like when we work, when we go to the office, when we construct buildings, It doesn't bring out the essence of a person. It may be a place where a person can express themselves. It may be something that the person does. But at the end of the day, what you do is not who you are. If you're a doctor, right, you practice medicine. If you're a lawyer, you practice law. You are not law. You are not medicine. These are things that you do. If you're a builder, that is not who you are. That is what you do. Unfortunately, people confuse the two way too often, where all of a sudden what they do becomes who they are. And after enough time, they start to forget who they actually are. You see, Shabbos is a time where we're supposed to focus on the bigger picture, on the bigger questions of life. And that is the purpose of life, why I'm here in the first place. And we need to be able to step away from that world. And the same thing is God. When it came to the 6 days of creation, that was God investing himself in something that was somewhat external to the true essence of God. So what happens on the seventh day? God rests. Rest means that God stopped creating, which means that God drew back into the true essence of everything that exists. And that's what we are trying to emulate on Shabbos. You see, there was once a Roman emperor in the 2nd century, Roman emperor who ruled over Judea. His name was Turnus Rufus. Turnus Rufus once asked Rabbi Akiva. Turnus Rufus was a general at this time. He asked Rabbi Akiva, and he says, the great sage Rabbi Akiva, he says, what is so special about Shabbos, the 7th day of the week? So Rabbi Akiva said, what is so special about you? To which he responded, the emperor, the king, Caesar, decided that I'm special, and he appointed me to be different than everybody else. So Rabbi Akiva says, and God appointed Shabbos to be a special day, different than all the other days of the week. So Turnus Rufus was a very wise man. And he said, okay, he knew about all the restrictions that Jews have on Shabbos. And he says to Rabbi Akiva, does God not keep the Torah? He says, sure, God keeps the Torah. That's part of the idea that God gave us the Torah because it's his commandments, because that's what God does. So Turnus Rufus says, is that so? Does it not rain on Shabbos? And the rain comes down, waters the fields, makes the crops grow. Does the wind not blow, carrying leaves and different items from one place to another? Aren't these restrictions of the Shabbos? To which Rabbi Akiva responds, to God, it is all one domain. Now, what that means simply is that one of the 39 acts on Shabbos that we are not allowed to do is that a city that does not have what is called an Eruv. A person is not allowed to take something from a private domain to a public domain or carry within a public domain. It has to you either have to be wearing it or you got to leave it at where it is. Now, Rabbi Akiva seems to only be addressing how God can make things move around on Shabbos and shift, which only addresses one of the 39 creative acts. How does that solve the other 38 creative acts? So the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, late 1700s, explains in a beautiful fashion, and he says as follows. If the whole idea of Shabbos, if you look at every one of the 39 creative acts, they're all about taking something which was in one state and transforming it to another. For example, cooking. You take a raw piece of meat. Before Shabbos, when Shabbos came in, this piece of meat was raw. You now cooked it. You've transformed it from an inedible piece of meat to an edible, enjoyable steak. Or take building. When Shabbos came in, these bricks were all scattered. Over Shabbos, you decided to put the bricks together and to build yourself a structure. What you have done was you've transformed these bricks from loose bricks to a structure. Take sewing. You've taken a bunch of strands of string and you've transformed them into a garment. Everything is about transforming it from point A to point B to something from something that wasn't to something that is. Now, the lowest form of all of these creative works is carrying. Because when you carry an item from point A to point B, from public domain to a private domain, or vice versa, You haven't changed the item itself. All the other 38 acts have changed and transformed this item. When it comes to carrying, you haven't transformed the item. All you've done was transformed its geographical location. It was now in this person's house. Now it's in this person's house. What change happened in the item? Absolutely nothing, just its location. And that's why it's, so to say, as the commentaries call it, the lowest form of an act, but nevertheless considered an act. And why is that? Because our job here in this world is to transform the world around us, to take the world around us and transform it into a godly place, that the world itself should recognize that we are all creations of God and that we all have a godly purpose, and we should follow that purpose. And it's our job to interact with the world in such a way. Now, this idea that we have to take the world from point A to point B, from a point where it does not recognize the oneness of God and does not recognize the fact that it is a godly creation with a godly purpose, and that it needs to be transformed and transported to a place where it does recognize that and where that idea is apparent, is like carrying something from one domain to another. Now, because of that, all of the laws of Shabbos really are accumulate and really come down to this point of going from one domain, which is the public domain, a world of fragmentation, a world of brokenness, a world of chaos, and bringing that to the private domain of God, revealing the godly essence of the world, revealing the godly purpose and divine design within all of creation. And this is what Rabbi Akiva was telling Torah Srofos. He says the reason why we can't engage in these activities is because for us, we'll be taking it from one place to another. For God, they're all already there. And therefore, there is no transformation of place. Now, based on this idea, that this is what Shabbos is all about. Shabbos is all about getting in touch with that godly purpose and the purpose and the reason that we are here. It's getting in touch with ourselves, with our families, learning Torah, experiencing the truth of the world the way it is supposed to be, and being able to take that throughout the 6 days of the week. The laws of Shabbos are here to ensure this. You see, many people look at the restrictions in Judaism, that Judaism's all about the nose. It's all about restrictions. Don't you feel tied up and restricted? The truth is, if you put your location, if you put your destination into the GPS, and the GPS gives you the most direct route to get to where you're going, and because of this, it negates you from from taking 1,000 different turns during your journey. Do you feel restricted, or do you feel relieved that I know how to get to my destination without taking the wrong turn? I know which turns not to take. Is that restrictive? On the contrary, that is the greatest release you can give a person. It's the greatest freedom you can give a person. You show them exactly where they need to go. And that's what Shabbos is all about. The restrictions on Shabbos are not there to restrict us, but on the contrary, they're there to guide us and to be able to give us the greatest experience of Shabbos. Now, the importance of that is, some of the ways that we do this, in order to create this reality, we're able to get in touch with ourselves, in touch with each other, connect with each other, and really find the oneness of God. So some of the ways is, as the Torah says, make Kiddush as soon as Shabbos comes in. Another way the Torah tells us is make sure to enjoy the Shabbos, make sure it's an enjoyable experience. But then there are 39 restrictions of how not to let negativity and unholiness disrupt the beauty of the day. By refraining from these acts, they will not distract you, and you will be able to live Shabbos properly. But then came along the rabbis and added another restriction, and that is, you, the Jew who walks around carrying Shabbos, make sure not to wander off beyond the city limits, beyond the limits that have been given to you, because if you do that, you will lose the sanctity of Shabbos. Let's unpack this idea, because we know that for a Jew, Shabbos is not just one day a week. Really, Shabbos is part of us every single day, because Shabbos represents the core of who I am, the core of why I am, and therefore the ability to be able to express that on a day-to-day basis. It's the ability to be able to live a life of higher purpose, a life truly dedicated to God, and the reason why I was created, and the reason why I'm here. And this idea exists on 3 levels. We know that everything in the Torah exists on the level of olam, which means place, shana, time, nefesh, and person. Whenever anything happens, it's really a convergence of these three things happening at once. There's the person that whatever is happening happens to. There's the time that it happens in and the place that it happens. But what that means is there are certain sacred spaces. Let's start with space. There are sacred spaces that we all have, be it a space within us, or really that would be going to something else. Let's talk about our sacred spaces, our homes, our shuls, our private spaces, our private areas. We don't just allow anything into these places. We only allow what fits and what's going to be conducive to these places. We protect the holiness and the sanctity of these places, whether it's our home or our shul. In time, this is Shabbos. Or on a daily basis, this is the time that is important for me to be connecting to who I am, such as the time of prayer, the time of learning, the time of day that I need, removed from all the distractions of the world, because the distractions of the world are only going to take me away from my purpose, as opposed to bring me closer. And then there's in myself, we know the importance of knowing who I am, my heart and my mind, not to let foreign concepts in, not to let things overtake me, not to let relationships rule me. We know this idea when it comes to boundaries, of relationships, be it between siblings, spouses, parents and children, in-laws. That's where all the breakdown of all relationships generally comes from a breakdown of boundaries, not having healthy boundaries, of knowing how far to push, how far not to push. And these are extremely important. So there's what we let in, and there's where we go with it. You see, there are certain areas in myself that I can't just take out into the open because they'll be destroyed. They're too vulnerable to be on display that way. It depends who's there. It depends where it is. And this is the idea of the boundaries of Shabbos. And all of this is to protect, again, just to summarize, the aspects of keeping what's unholy out and keeping what's holy in the right place and not taking it beyond its limits are in order to protect Shabbos, in order to protect ourselves, not to lose our identity, not to lose what is so holy and special about Shabbos and the Jewish person. Just like to conclude with a beautiful story that I read. In about the year 1910, there was a girl named Rose Goldstein. She grew up in Poland, and unfortunately, like many families, she was one of 9 children, and her family was very, very poor. They came up with just enough money to afford a one-way ticket to America. And out of the 9 children, she was the one chosen at 12 years old to go to America to live with her relatives. And she'd go to the land of opportunity, the golden Medina, the golden world, where over there she would be able to make money, hopefully send some back to the family. And like this, she would be able to start a new life. You can just imagine how she felt, and as well as her father, when he walked her to the ship, carrying her case for her with all her little belongings that she had. And as he takes her to the boat, trying to control his emotions, and he turns to his daughter, Rose, and he says, "My daughter, one thing I want you to remember when you're in America, never forget about Shabbos. Shabbos has kept the Jewish people alive, and the Jewish people have kept Shabbos. Keep this with you forever." They hugged each other, and they wanted to embrace so tightly in such a way that this was almost, in their minds, this would be the last embrace they would ever have. Finally, it was time to depart. She gets on the ship. After a couple of days of the journey, they're about to hit the harbor of New York. Everybody's looking excitedly, and she's sitting there worried. She doesn't know if she's coming to a new land where she's going to be homeless, or her relatives are actually going to take her in. But luckily, as the ship arrives, her relatives are there eagerly waiting to take her home. They take her home. They treat her like one of their own. They set her up. And after a couple of weeks, she finally finds a job in a factory. What's the job? She's going to work the sewing machine in a factory. Huge factory with close to 200 employees, and she'd be one of the ones operating the sewing machine. And she was very excited about this. Her family was very excited about this. Meanwhile, now that she's in America, people are very free, very liberal. They're not such great fans of religion. Her relatives used to tell her, listen, forget about the Judaism that you had at home back in the shtetl. In America, you don't need that accessory. You don't need the religion. And they were getting to her. She started to change the way she dressed, the way she spoke, and she lost many of her old ancient customs that she had back home in the shtetl. However, there was one thing that she was extremely strong in, because she remembered her father's parting words, and that is keep Shabbos. And she decided she wasn't going to work on Shabbos. So the first week she came up with an excuse. She hurt her hand. The second week she came up with an excuse. She had a stomach ache. The third week was a headache. Finally, after a few weeks, the foreman had enough and said, listen, girl, you got to understand something. Enough with your Shabbos shtick. In America, you're going to work. If you don't show up to work this coming Shabbos, you're fired. Find yourself a new job. She went home. She told her relatives. And to her surprise, or she shouldn't have been so surprised, they started to pressure her. Of course, you got to keep the job. You got to go back to work. Forget about Shabbos. This is America here. You got to work. This is the new world. We're not in the shtetl anymore. And she was extremely torn. She wants to keep her life. She wants to keep her friends. She wants to keep close with her family. But at the same time, how can she let go of what her father told her? How can she lose the identity of herself? Her father told her, you're a Jew, and a Jew keeps Shabbos. She didn't want to lose that. But at the same time, she didn't want to lose the new life she built for herself. Finally comes the dreaded day. It's Shabbos morning. She wakes up and she leaves the house as if she's going to work so that her family wouldn't bother her. But instead of going to work, she's just walking around Manhattan, doing nothing. After walking around Manhattan long enough, she finds herself in Thompson Park, and she's just walking, making laps. Like we spoke before, you can walk however much you want on Shabbos, as long as it's not beyond the boundaries. She sits on the benches, looks at the birds, has nothing else to do, nowhere else to go. Finally, 3 stars come out. Shabbos is over. She can go home. Reluctantly, she makes her way home. And she doesn't know how she's going to face her family because she's certain that they found out somehow that she didn't go to work. And as she's coming towards her relative's house, she sees her cousin in the distance, and she sees some kind of fury, some kind of excitement. And she thinks to herself, oh no, they found out. How am I going to face them? And her cousin comes running over and says, oh, Rose, how are you here? She says, I know, I didn't go to work. Please don't hold it over my head. Give me an easy time. I just lost my job. She says, no. How are you alive? She says, what do you mean? She says, you didn't hear about what happened? I said, no. Turns out there was a huge fire that broke out in the factory. Only 40 people survived because there were no regulations. And unfortunately, 100 out of 190 workers, only 40 people survived. And this was the famous fire the infamous fire, I should say, in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory on Saturday, March 25th, 1911, claimed the lives of 146 immigrant workers. But her life was spared. Her identity was spared. Her existence and what she felt as the existence of a Jew. The Jew keeps Shabbos and Shabbos keeps the Jew.